The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Refugees on the Border with Susan Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald has fed hundreds of refugees and housed some herself as a volunteer at El Calvario Refugee Shelter in Las Cruces, New Mexico, 40 miles from the U.S. Mexico border. She moved to New Mexico in 2006 after retiring from a long career at KTOO in Juneau.
Thank you, Carl. That was a lovely introduction. And I have to say that a couple of weeks ago at the shelter where I work, somebody offered to make everybody name tags. So you work in the cook, the la cocinera, you work in the kitchen, you work in the supply room, but we could pick whatever title we wanted. So I decided that I was going to be the jefe de galletas, the chief of cookies, because it's something I do every week when I come in. I bake cookies and bring them for the other volunteers and for the refugees. So I'm the jefe de galletas, and that is my permanent title. Refugees on the border. I started being interested in refugees when I first moved, in immigration actually, when I first moved to Las Cruces in 2007. And then it was a matter of changing policy, improving the laws so that immigration was an easier process, a better process, just something that worked for everybody. That's all changed now. You know, the process is kind of out the window, and we have thousands of asylum seekers on our border, and we have lots of people who are looking to come to this country as immigrants through all of the other venues, which are, I think the last time I heard, the backlog in immigration cases was like 1 million. And we don't even begin to have enough judges or courtrooms or personnel processing this stuff to ever get through that. I have a good friend who took it, her mother about 2 years ago got her green card from Mexico. It took them 20 years to pursue that process. And this was part of the family reunification. This was before the current administration, so even in previous administrations. Getting to this country legally in any way, shape, or form is really difficult. My family were immigrants. My father was born in New York City, but he didn't speak English until he went to grade school. He grew up speaking Yiddish. My mother was born in 1915 in Ashmiany in Belarus, and she came, so this is, first picture is the church where I work. This is my story. My mother and my grandmother and my 2 uncles, I don't think it was, maybe it was a passport. It was the papers they used to come to this country in 1921. My grandfather came in 1914. By 1921, he was settled enough and had made enough money that he could afford to bring his wife and 3 kids and his mother to this country. So I'm sort of first generation, and grew up in the kind of household that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where there was a second language spoken, and food customs and social customs were just a little bit different than the standard American kind of household. So for that reason, I feel compelled to work with immigrants, and my faith tradition as a Jew tells me that I must welcome the stranger, and I certainly know what it was like for many in my family after World War II who were desperate for a place to land where they could be safe. So I am, I keep forgetting to touch this so the text goes away. So my story, how come I'm interested in the plight of immigrants? A little bit of history. These are the 3 Northern Triangle countries of Central America: Guatemala, Salvador, and Honduras. Salvador being the smallest of them, and Guatemala having the largest indigenous population, and Honduras being the only one of the 3 where they have any sense of what a flour tortilla is. Everybody else eats only corn tortillas. And I found that, just happened to find that out. When they're in detention, they get fed mostly ramen noodles or frozen bean burritos. And they look at the frozen bean burritos, they're heated up in the microwave, but they say, what is this? We recognize the beans, but what's this thing around it? And oftentimes they have chili in them, and they mostly don't eat chili. So it's their welcome to this country is very unkind. So these are the 3 Northern Triangle countries that comprise the bulk of the asylum seekers who are coming now. And let's be clear, these are people looking for asylum. The number of people now who are crossing the border illegally, in other words, not turning themselves in, just crossing and trying to escape into the country and become part of the mass of immigrants, that's at historic lows. And that was mostly Mexican men, and then later on their families. Now, there are very few of those. The Mexicans are staying home. People are actually going back to Mexico. Americans are moving to Mexico. We're seeing the folks from Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador. Folks from Nicaragua go south to Costa Rica. And that's about as far as they're going to go, getting through Panama. And then, then you've got Colombia and Venezuela, and those aren't reasonable places to go right now. A little bit of history here. El Salvador, Farabundo Martí led a peasant revolt in 1932. It was quelled by the U.S. and the U.K. A series of revolutions and coups followed. The U.S. always supported the anti-communists. From 1980 until 1992, there was a civil war. 80,000 were killed. Then we got free trade, and that brought multinational control of domestic trade. The U.S. used threats to end protections for locally sourced corn and beans, and local manufacturers suffered because U.S. goods came in tariff-free. So there's Salvador, where we have lots to do with creating a difficult situation. Then in Honduras, United Fruit and Chiquita Banana, and this is my favorite slide of all, with the gun under the bananas. In 1911, a U.S. entrepreneur and a U.S. general partnered with the deposed president to launch a coup and reinstate the deposed president, Manuel Bonilla. When Bonilla was reelected, he awarded his U.S. backers with concessions and tax incentives to the 2 companies that then became United Fruit and Dole. By 1914, they owned 1 million acres of the best land in Honduras. And over the years, frequent U.S. intervention helped them to hold on to that land. In 1980, Reagan sent troops to train Contras to fight the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. They did that in Honduras. And then we got free trade again, which brought trade imbalances to Honduras. It went from being a net agricultural exporter to a net agricultural importer. And in 2009, we overthrew, under Hillary Clinton, with the State Department, the progressive president, Zelaya. Then we move on to Guatemala, and the name of Jacobo Arbenz is probably more familiar to a lot of people. He was overthrown by the Eisenhower administration and the CIA. But it started back in 1920 when President Cabrera, who was an ally of U.S. corporate interests, was overthrown in a coup. We sent troops in to ensure that his replacement would be amenable to U.S. interests. In 1947, President Juan José Arevalo started a workers' government, enacting labor codes that gave workers the right to unionize and ask for pay raises. United Fruit, of course, lobbied for intervention. The next president was Arbenz, and he began agrarian land reforms, returning land to mostly indigenous people. Eisenhower authorized his overthrow by the CIA, and then in 1982, we backed a second coup, installing President Efraín Ríos Montt. In 2013, Montt was convicted of genocide for trying to exterminate an indigenous Mayan group, the Ixil. Then, of course, came free trade, which did the same thing to Guatemala as it did to the other 2 countries. So I'm not a student of this history particularly. I'm interested in the countries and why people have been motivated, why they need to come here. And there are a couple of themes that have become obvious to me. CAFTA and NAFTA have decimated local agriculture and created trade imbalances. A prolonged reaction to the Cold War fear of communism on our borders, and protection of U.S. economic interests in other countries. And we need to add to that right now climate change. These are the first of the climate refugees that we're going to be seeing for a long time to come. Failure of local agriculture, If you like coffee and chocolate and bananas, enjoy them while you can. They may not be affordable much longer. Bananas are a monoculture. Every banana you see in the store is a Cavendish banana, and they are no longer producing as well as they used to. They're subject to some diseases, and there are lots of places where bananas won't grow anymore. There's a coffee rust, and there's another disease for chocolate that I don't know the name of, but they are all problems for those three crops. So lots of people coming to our borders, and as I said before, they can't go south. There's no place to go. Costa Rica's taken several 100,000 Nicaraguans. They're safe, they're stable, but you know, they could run into problems. And this was interesting to me. We didn't have an immigration office, an Office of Immigration, until 1924. And then it was in the Department of Labor. In 1940, it got moved to the Department of Justice. So we've moved from people being workers to criminals. And then in 2002, it went into Homeland Security. So now we look at immigrants as potential terrorists. So I've made up a story about a putative immigrant asylum seeker. Her name's Carolina Martinez Ramirez, and she's here with her son Uvaldo Solis Ramirez, and they're from maybe the western highlands of Guatemala, or from Tegucigalpa in Honduras, or an aldea, a village in El Salvador. And the crops are failing. They can no longer grow their heritage corn and bean crops because they can't sell them anymore. You have to sell the Monsanto seed produced crops back to the United States. Or maybe in Tegucigalpa, your family has a tienda, a little shop, but the extortion is running you out of business. You can't make enough money to feed your family and buy the necessities and also pay money to the gangs that are extorting from you. And you know, maybe you're in a small village in Salvador, and agriculture and climate change, the lack of agricultural opportunities and climate change are making it impossible for you to survive. In many cases, somebody in your family has already come to this country, a husband, a mother, a brother, and you decide that it's worth the effort to try and join them. I read recently that something like 10% of Guatemala's gross domestic product is from money sent back from the United States. So even though these immigrants are working minimum wage jobs or maybe less than minimum wage jobs and living pretty close to the edge, they're still able to send enough money back to form a significant amount of Guatemala's GDP. So you know that by going to the States, El Norte, you're going to make more money, you're going to be able to live a more comfortable life, your kids will go to school, you don't have to pay for uniforms once they get out of primary school like you do in those three countries. If they're smart, they may have the opportunity to go to college, and you know, who knows, you may end up with a pretty decent job that will allow you to put food on the table 3 times a day instead of maybe 3 or 4 times a week. So you hire a coyote and you spend several $1,000s to have them guide you through Guatemala or Honduras to Mexico, and through Mexico, and then to one of the places where you're going to cross, maybe Brownsville, Laredo, or El Paso, or Yuma, Arizona. And you cross the bridge, you cross the river. Sometimes you wait a long time. In Juarez, you can wait a very long time to even be considered to cross and turn yourself in and ask for asylum. And international law says we have to accept people who ask for asylum. You're given a hearing, and if you can prove that you have credible fear and your name's not on some computer list of felons in your country, then you get in with some very perfunctory papers. You need to have a sponsor who is usually someone in your family. Sometimes it's the other end of the coyote's operation, and that's kind of scary. And usually at this point, your most prized possession is that little piece of notebook paper that has a phone number and an address in pencil that's been folded up in your pocket for so long, it's almost illegible. But that's your contact. And Border Patrol or ICE has seen that, and they've put that name on your papers. So sometimes you're in detention for a few days where you sleep on the floor with the Mylar blankets, and other people with Mylar blankets hold them up in front of the toilet so that you have a little privacy. And you might not get water for your baby if your baby is crying in the middle of the night. You might get formula, you might not. You might get a guard who treats you decently, and more often than not, you don't. A woman told me a story last week that the Border Guard Patrol officer who processed her and her son said, "You know, you're taking food out of my children's mouths." Illnesses are ignored. Everybody gets to our shelter, not everybody, but many people come with something wrong with them. So you spend a few days in detention, and then if it's ICE who's picked you up, they have an arrangement in El Paso with a shelter called Annunciation House. And Annunciation House has a number of other shelters that they work with, so they parcel people out. The Africans, and there are many Africans, go to a couple of shelters. The Brazilians go to another shelter, and there's some who come up to us in Las Cruces. Border Patrol puts people in buses and dumps them. They'll dump them at Annunciation House or at the Greyhound station, or they'll take them out to Deming, which you've probably heard on the radio the last couple of days. Deming has 15,000 people, and they've been getting 1,000 or so migrants a week. And they really don't have the resources to deal with them. I'm sure that's done on purpose. They could easily deal with them in Las Cruces or El Paso, or take them up to Albuquerque, which is only 3 hours away. Deming is 2, Albuquerque is going to be 3.5 or 4. So they're released from custody, they go to a shelter, and that's the end of a journey and the beginning of a new one. And that's where what I do comes in. So these are people getting off the bus and waiting to go into our shelter. We take their papers and go through them and make sure that they are as accurate as they can possibly be, with good destination addresses, that they're sending you to a sponsor and not to the Guatemalan consulate in Washington, D.C., that they're sending you, that the place where your court date is in reasonable proximity to where you're actually going. Doesn't always happen that way. Then they're welcomed by Pastor Miller, who's in the back in the blue shirt. They go into the sanctuary and they get a welcome, and he does it in English and somebody translates for him. And this is the kitchen, where, not a very big kitchen, but boy, a lot of good food comes out of there. The woman in the middle, her name is Susana. She's my tocaya, my namesake. And that's her she usually does travel arrangements, but she's taking a break here to whip up some mole from scratch for everybody. And then there's stuff shoved everywhere in this old church. So these are the kitchen shelves. And people bring all kinds of interesting things as food donations. My favorite, though, was about 2 weeks ago, somebody dropped off a jar of gefilte fish. I got to take it home after answering everybody's questions as to what gefilte fish actually was. This is the supply room, and you've got here one of the kids offering to help out. The couple in the back have been helping for a while, and the woman in the front is their friend who's visiting for a couple of weeks, and she comes with them every day. This is where people get hygiene supplies and where they pack up the snack stuff that people take on the bus or the plane with them. We have a prefab shed that's used for clothing. And again, people donate lots of amazing things. Last winter, somebody brought 2 mink stoles. I'm not sure. Yeah. Then we have volunteer doctors and nurses who come from Memorial Medical Center, is our big local hospital, and they are a teaching hospital, so they have a lot of residents who work for them. And then there's an osteopathic medical college in town. So they all provide volunteers, and Nurses in town come as well. And last week on The World, a week ago Monday, there was a story about it. The nurse, Frida, who actually works at our shelter, and she's one of the organizers. And then the state provides this mobile medical van. Most people's illnesses are bad blisters, ear infections, upper respiratory infections. Last fall, our shelter in particular had a kid who had rotavirus and almost died. Those folks end up in the hospital. And the hospital's really good about, they just get them in there, no questions asked, nobody wants to see their papers. This kid was in pediatric intensive care for a couple of days. And imagine a child from a remote village in a hospital needing to have an IV, trying to understand what this is all about. Had a kid a couple of weeks ago who was recovering from chicken pox. We have the use of a couple of houses, and she and her father went to a house so that she could recuperate. She was beyond being contagious, but still looked pretty bad. This is travel. The gentleman on the phone is booking people. The lady in the middle standing up is calling a family, and here you have a gentleman and his son, and they're calling his family, and the son's talking to his grandmother for the first time ever. He's never met her. And so we call the families and ask them, and say, we have your family here, we have your son, your cousin, your brother, whomever, and they're in New Mexico. No, it's not Mexico, it's New Mexico. And we're ready to send them on to you. And then I and several other people do the work of researching how much it's going to cost. And we say, if they come by bus, it'll be this much. If they come by plane, it will be this much. There are flights tomorrow, there are buses in 2 days. What can you afford? Well, sometimes they have the money ready and they can afford that plane right now, which is great. Sometimes you say, do you have a credit card? What's a credit card? Do you have a debit card? No. Do you have a friend who has a credit card? Oh, I think maybe my friend has a credit card. Can you ask your friend if you can charge these flights or bus tickets on his credit card? Okay, I'll call you back. Or, I have a debit card, but I don't have enough money in the bank to cover whatever it is, but I can put money in the bank tomorrow. Can I call you back? Yes, you can call me back. Or sometimes people are afraid that it's fraud, and I say, we want to buy the tickets. We would prefer that they didn't buy the tickets because it's always a problem, but sometimes that's the only way. And so you get people who buy tickets for flights that leave from Albuquerque because they have no idea what the map looks like. Or flights that leave from El Paso at 2 o'clock in the morning. And of course, we're volunteers. Taking somebody to the airport for a 2 o'clock a.m. flight or a 5 a.m. flight is asking a lot of a volunteer. And they don't speak English, and many of them don't read very well. So airports are frightening places. So we try and make the reservations so that we know that we have the boarding passes or their bus tickets in hand. And then we take them to the airport. The city pitches in at this point. They have a shelter where they bring people in and then send them out to the other shelters. And they help with the transportation. So we put people on buses and vans to the bus station and the airport. We work with 4 bus lines. 3 of them are Hispanic owned. They're great. The 4th one is Greyhound. I really can't think of a single good, positive thing to say about Greyhound. That's just the way it is. Making reservations is difficult. Buses don't come, or they're very late. They dump the migrants off the bus if they're oversold. They'll just dump you off in Dallas and say, you can get on a bus 2 days from now. These are people who may have been given $15 or $20 to help them on their way. 60 hours to New York City on the bus and maybe 5 transfers. I'm amazed that as many get there as do. And my favorite experience was talking to the gentleman at the call center who was from the Indian subcontinent who absolutely could not comprehend how to spell Hispanic names. Just, never the twain shall meet. We got cut off, and I was really very grateful that we cut off, and I had to start all over again. This was yesterday. I missed it. Our Senator, Tom Udall, one of our senators, was there in the, at the shelter checking things out. So he's with Linda McCamley, who's retired. Her husband was in the military, and her son is the equivalent of the Secretary of Labor, I guess. And then Susanna and Letty, and Susanna and Letty and I all work together in transportation, learning English and learning your rights from the ACLU. So basic kind of guerrilla English and basic, what are your rights as an asylum seeker traveling across the country. Just some scenes from the shelter. Because we get so many people, the chances are pretty good. At least once a week, we have somebody with a birthday. So we try and celebrate it. The gentleman in the middle was from Honduras, and he spoke English. God bless him. He was such a help in explaining to the other refugees what was going on, because they trusted him more than they trusted us. And then this was in the ladies' bathroom, and need to have your hair done. You've had a shower. Your hair is clean, let's braid it or curl it or do something nice with it. The woman getting it done is Carolina, who was with us for 3 days, and she was always walking around saying, can I get you a cup of coffee? Can I make something to eat? Are you hungry? And I'm saying, wait, we're here to help you get to your family, and you want to feed us? In the shelter, working in the kitchen and looking at the map and realizing how big this country is, and figuring out where you're going. And the kids. It's an old building and we have a gravel parking lot, but the kids ride those toys and play soccer and amuse themselves pretty well. Helping to clean, and then the little boy in the middle first he had the animal crackers and he didn't want to share them. Then he was kind of grinning about it. And then he was crying, and then he fell asleep on that chair. And the kids, we have one long hallway, and you're taking your life in your hands sometimes. The kids scoot up and down it. But they've been on the road, and then they are they're in detention, and this is the first chance that they've had to be kids. So you have to let them be kids and not stop them. We get a lot of financial donations, and one day Nicolette, who's in the hat in the back and is one of the administrative assistants, corralled a bunch of the guys to help write thank you notes for the donations. And putting them on the bus to say goodbye. And then this family, the family of 5, they had driven from Missouri to pick up their relatives. They said they drove, but they got there from Missouri in like a day and a half. They were really moving. We had 2 families leave that way that week. And I guess that's pretty much what I need. I'm going to look at my notes again to see if I missed anything. I don't think so. So you see, people sleep in the community room. They sleep in the sanctuary. Sometimes when the sanctuary is empty, they take a moment to say their prayers. The church is El Calvario United Methodist Church, and there's a Facebook page with an Amazon wish list, and you can check that out, or El Calvario United Methodist Church, Refugee Mission, if you would have any interest in making a financial donation to the church. Every little bit helps. We have, probably a ton of beans in the storeroom, but we always need diapers and milk and eggs, and the utility bill is about $3,000 a month for the church. And it's a very small congregation, and this is pretty much all that they do, is make sure that this operation runs. Imagine the laundry. Imagine all these people wanting to clean their clothes. And when I've had people at my home, the first thing they want to do is take a shower. And I always have a supply of sweatpants and sweatshirts for people to put on while they wash their clothes. And sometimes they didn't want to wash them. They just want to throw them. They are so tired of having lived in those clothes and having lived in detention in those clothes that they cannot even bear the thought of putting them on again, even if they're clean. So I will take questions now from anybody who would like to ask a question. Microphone's over there. Line, just come on up to the microphone so that it can be recorded.
Would you talk about the people's experiences in detention? Mm-hmm. What we've read in the newspapers, pretty bad.
And it's very true. I've had many of the women share those experiences with me. And people come in and they've been physically abused by Border Patrol. Or somebody else? You were.
Do you do any follow-up to make sure that people have arrived where they're supposed to, or intended to?
We try. Sometimes they'll call us back, and I have a few families that keep in pretty regular touch with me, people who've stayed with me. But you know, when you're dealing with 30 and 40 families a week, it gets to be almost impossible, and yet you get really close to them. You wish they would let you know. And sometimes they want to kind of disappear into the underground that exists.
Thank you for being here. I was really curious to hear about your experiences because in the fall I was in Europe volunteering with refugee crisis there. But I'm really curious if you could elaborate a little bit more about your day-to-day, and then I have a follow-up question.
Day-to-day. So I usually work 4 or 5 days a week depending on the refugee flow. And because we're volunteers, we come when we can. And when we can't come, we just don't come, and we manage to always have enough people. The gentleman who actually runs the shelter is a volunteer, retired military, both Marines and the Army. And he's from Puerto Rico, so he's got fluent Spanish. And I don't know how he does it. He's there pretty much 24/7. There are people who stay at night in case problems come up at night. But yeah, the people usually come in late morning, so I'll go, 9:30 or 10 and make sure all the paperwork is ready for them to come in. And then as soon as they come in, I get to, those of us who are there start making sure their paperwork is okay, and then just start talking to people and making reservations, and sometimes until 8 or 9 at night, when we're assuming that any sensible person on the East Coast is asleep for the night. And for those people who offer to have we need to move to burner phones, but if you use your own phone, then at 3 o'clock in the morning, what time did you say my brother was coming? The flight didn't come in, and people do get left at bus and plane stations. The plane didn't take off, and there's somebody at the airport. Who do they call? So come pick that, or somebody. And sometimes our volunteers, when they take people to the airport, will see someone like that. They'll bring them back to the shelter, even if they didn't start with us, and we'll get them rebooked and back to the airport. So it's 24/7, but you can always, turn your phone off or.
Okay, that goes into my next question, and I'm wondering how do you reconcile your privilege of being a U.S. citizen and privilege of movement with this activity? Because you just said you can turn off your phone. You don't have to. You can have time for yourself. How do you reconcile? I
have a really hard time reconciling that. I had a gentleman stay with me a couple of weeks ago. He had been It was the first big group of this last bunch of refugees to come in. And somebody who didn't know what they were doing booked him to the wrong destination on Greyhound. And he couldn't get out for 2 days. We had to rebook him and then get him out again. And we had to figure out a way to pay for the ticket because his family couldn't pay for it, a second ticket. And Greyhound, no, you buy the ticket, you use it, that's it. So I got a call at 10 o'clock on a Sunday night. Can I put this guy up until we figure out where he's going, how he's going to get where he's going? I said, sure. So they came, and I fed him and his son a snack and put them to bed. And then the next day I explained what was happening. And I say I have enough Spanish to get into trouble, but not to get out of it. And he's walking around my house, and I live in, it's about 1,500 square feet, and it's a standard 3-bedroom, 2-bath tract home. It's, it's nice, but it's nothing fancy. And he's walking around and he's saying to me, "You live here alone. There's only one person in this house, And then, that's just like, it's my normal. And I have a really hard time with that. My privilege is right there in front of me all day, every day. I can't avoid it. So I have to make the best use of it that I can.
Susan, offer us some scenarios for the long term, the bigger picture. What are we dealing with in the longer term? You remember Ehrlich and Paul and Ann Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Is this what we're seeing?
I'm going to say that what we're seeing is not that so much. We're certainly seeing the first wave of climate refugees, and that's going to go on for a long time because anybody in that part of the world is going to be affected. We see the Central and South Americans in Europe, they see the Africans. Until somebody sits down and figures out a reasonable way to allow immigration to this country, we're in for a miserable time. We need the immigrants. They certainly are, they contribute in many ways, as we all know. But nobody seems to want to do anything except point fingers and complain and foment fear. I wish I had some kind of sense of what would happen, but right now we're just running around putting Band-Aids on wounds that need major surgery.
Is there any way we could improve conditions in those home countries?
Certainly more aid of all kinds that was appropriately spent. I know we give lots of aid, but it doesn't always get to where it can do the most good. So I'm sort of the Band-Aid person. I'm not the policy person when it comes to that. We talk about, in the group of community organizers that I work with, we talk about it a lot, but nobody seems to have at this point, a really clear idea. You've got all of these people. You've got 11 million previous undocumented immigrants. And you've got the couple of million dreamers who have their DACA cards, and really, that should be like a no-brainer. I know so many of these young people who are going to school and have jobs, and and they're Americans. They're nothing else, and they need to be part of who we are. But how many people know what a mixed status family is? Mixed status family. So I have a dear friend who is undocumented. She came across the border illegally with somebody else's visa, visitor visa, and never went back. Her significant other has a green card. He could become a citizen if he wanted. He's never done it. Her oldest daughter is a DACA recipient, a dreamer, and her younger daughter was born here, so she's a citizen. So in one family, you have 4 different citizenship statuses. Yeah. And just imagine, how did the 2 sisters get along? One's legal, and she's eligible for food stamps if they need them, for Medicaid, for college scholarships. But her older sister is not eligible for any of that. Try raising a family where not only are your kids different because they're different people, but they have different legal statuses in the country.
Thank you so much, Susan, for throwing some light on something that to most of us is hard to even imagine. I'm wondering if the people who have no contact ever get in. I mean, you made a big deal about the little scrap of paper and the contact. What if you don't have a contact?
I think you need to have a contact, or at least pretend that you have a contact. I don't know how I think Border Patrol and ICE call those contacts before they release you to make sure that they're actually viable people.
Would they just send you back across if you did not have a contact
I
piece
don't
of
know.
paper?
There is, Border Patrol and ICE are so unregulated. There are no records of what they do. And of course, the story is ultimately follow the money. People are in detention, in private detention centers for long periods of time. Hey, somebody's making money. housing them. So if you don't have a contact, they might throw you in a detention center for months on end before they pull you up before an immigration judge who says, you have no right to be here, we're deporting you. But first we're going to put you in jail for breaking the law and being here illegally. Then after you've served your jail term, then you can go back. So, you know, people are treated.
And I'm assuming there's trafficking goes on.
There is trafficking that goes on, yeah.
You pay, you might get in, or something like that.
There's trafficking. People game the system by trying to pass off their 19-year-olds as 16-year-olds. And there are stories of Border Patrol people seeing the same kids passing, going back and forth. You know, they get it, somebody, because everybody knows you have a better chance of getting asylum if you come with a child. So some kids they cross the border and then they're sent back and they cross the border again. Every kid I've seen has stuck to his or her parent like glue. They are so afraid of being separated.
And I had one other piece. I wondered if the bulk of people seeking asylum were coming from better off families down there, or were you getting the poorest of the poor?
Not the poorest of the poor, because they can't afford the coyote. So you're getting above the poorest of the poor, except for the Brazilians who come and they already have their boarding passes on their telephones. And why, I don't know. They're asking, I mean, the situation is not good in Brazil, but these are not people who are, you know, who are suffering from economic circumstances at this point. And the Brazilians usually are you know, pretty middle class kinds of people. I don't know much about why they're coming.
Are they traveling by foot or bus or train, or how are they?
They come by.
Is it a caravan of walkers?
Well, mostly they're groups who come together and they travel by bus or by truck, or they walk. The Cubans fly, lots of Cubans. They fly from Havana to Cancun, and then they fly to Monterrey or Juarez and come across there, and they're asking for political asylum.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was Susan Fitzgerald in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded May 31st, 2019 at KTOO in Juneau, with support from AEL&P, Coeur Alaska, Kensington Mine, Haight and Associates, Ramada by Wyndham, Sea Alaska, the University of Alaska Southeast, and Wastman and Associates.